Gone Fishing by Sarah Scharnweber. Abe Fields took a few deep breaths and closed the car door. He didn't want to cry in front of people, and even with the rain, someone could still see him if they happened to walk by his car. He clenched his eyes as tight as he could, and ground his teeth and pushed back the tears. When he opened his eyes again, he looked down at his hands on the steering wheel, and a wave of nostalgic sadness washed over him. Long, deep wrinkles ran along his knuckles, and the wrinkled, scarred skin on the backs of his hands had begun to pick up various freckles and spots. Years of his life had been spent outdoors doing dangerous, sometimes even stupid things, and his hands told the story of many of his failures during that time. The palms of his hands and tips of his fingers had more highways and divots than a palm reader could process, and the skin felt dry and tight when he made a fist. He reminded himself that time passing was out of his control, and took a long, deep breath before pulling out onto the road, where he proceeded past the smattering of people still dallying outside the funeral home. He closed the garage door and turned the car off. He didn't know what he was going to do, but he didn't climb out right away. His eyes looked at the inside wall of his garage and let the tears fall, allowing his eyes to wander from one wall to the next, and even around the interior of his car. He was trying too hard to see anything clearly, but letting his eyes wander did seem to make the tears dry up faster. After a few minutes, he wiped his cheeks with the palm of his hand and headed into the house. He sat in his living room in the dark and thought of Gus. Gus had been his best friend for years, and as of recently, since Cliff died, Gus was his only friend. Abe's entire family was gone, and now his last friend had passed away too. Gus had helped him through his wife's death, but who was left to help him deal with losing Gus? Last year, when Cliff died, Abe and Gus talked about how alone either of them would be when the other's time came. Their fishing group had at one point been almost 10 people, but as time ticked away, their group dwindled. Abe thought he remembered Gus saying he didn't think he'd live long if Abe died, and Abe knew that's how he had felt about Gus, but it wasn't real then. He leaned back on the couch and closed his eyes, but he didn't even feel tired. Tomorrow morning would have been the big fishing trip he and Gus planned months ago. Since Gus died until this moment, Abe thought it was a trip he wouldn't be taking. But as he sat there thinking about Gus, he realized going fishing might be just what he needed. He walked back out to the garage and pulled down his camping and fishing equipment and packed it into his car. Despite the fact that they hadn't planned on staying overnight, he thought having a little more time by himself might be good for him. He checked to make sure the cooler was clean before heading out. As he always did, he was going to stop at this little mom-and-pop store on the way there, where he could get ice and all of the things he would need for a successful overnight. Abe parked in the same spot he always did at the campground, only this year Gus wouldn't park next to him. He thought about Gus's high-pitched laugh and how they used to make fun of him because of how different it was from his speaking voice. He could almost hear his laugh in the distance and felt a smile drift across his lips. He loaded himself up with gear like a human packed mule and started on the familiar path to his favorite camping area. He was relieved to find their usual site was empty, so he lay his stuff in front of the pre-built fire pit, pulled out his tent, and popped it open with a few clicks. He was relieved that he had bought one he could open so easily. He was in no mood to fight with tent poles. Once his campsite was set up the way he wanted, he stood on the riverbank and looked across the water. He tried to look into the water, but it was too murky for him to see past the surface. He cast blindly into the middle of the river and watched as the lure disappeared below the water. He pulled his camp chair nearer to the bank and got comfortable. If there weren't any fish, it would be even more relaxing than if there were, but he dare not wish for no fish. He already planned to throw anything he caught back unless he were to catch something impressive. It was late afternoon after an emotional day, and he was ready to relax. Abe crossed his legs at the ankle and kicked back in his chair with his hand loosely holding the rod as it bobbed a bit on and off. Just as he was starting to wonder if he should give up until the morning, something grabbed the lure and nearly pulled the rod out of his hand. As he tightened his grip, there was a stronger tug. He stood up and gripped the rod with both hands as he tried to bring the fish up. Maybe this was the fish he had considered as an exception to his throwing them back rule. He took a step closer to the water, but with each step, the mud became softer. He sank a bit here, but didn't fall. Instead, he was sure his shoe was going to stay where it was for the foreseeable future. But he continued struggling with the huge fish, ignoring the issues he had with his shoe. As he struggled, he thought about the time Gus's huge catch turned out to be a tree branch, and he hoped he was wrestling with something living. He stepped forward again, knowing he would be submerging his feet a bit, and as he did, his feet slipped out from under him, and he landed on his butt in the mud, pulling his foot from his boot and leaving it behind in the mud. He dropped the rod as he fell and tried to stand back up, but it was too slick, so he lowered to his knees and tried to bury the toe of his shoe in the mud as an anchor. He grabbed the rod again just as the mud slipped out from under his knees, sending him face first into the water. He caught himself with the palm of his free hand, but his face dunked beneath the water for a second, setting muddy water up into his sinuses. As he pushed himself back up, Mud and water dripped from his nose, pouring down the back of his throat. He could feel it collecting in his stomach and started to feel like he might vomit. Before he could, he felt more tugging on his line, and he lurched forward so as not to lose it again. He teetered as he tried to get further into the water and hopefully get a better angle on whatever he was still trying to reel in. Just as he was about to push himself back to his feet, something brushed past the front of his legs. He looked down, but the water was murkier here than it was further out. In a panic, he pushed himself to his feet and turned back to the shore just as a sharp pain exploded across his calf. He turned back and saw something dip beneath the surface. When he looked down, he noticed the murkiness around his legs was growing darker. He dragged himself up onto shore, his legs being unable to hold his weight. His arms were losing strength quickly, and he took just a brief moment to catch his breath when something chomped down on his ankle and dragged him into the water. He gasped for air as he struggled to bring his head above water. His face breached the surface dozens of times, but after a few moments, whatever had him pulled him beneath the surface, and the water went still.